It was a crisp fall morning in Briarwood National Park, the kind of day where the sun barely touched the earth, its light filtered through the dense canopy of ancient trees. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. To outsiders, it might seem like just another peaceful retreat for nature lovers, but to Jamie Whitaker, a quiet, introspective 13-year-old boy, it was a place where he could escape from the noise of the world. Jamie had always been fascinated by nature. While other kids his age were obsessed with video games and the latest trends, Jamie found solace in sketching birds in his leather-bound notebook, capturing their grace with each stroke of his pencil. His family had come to Briarwood for a weekend camping trip, something they had done many times before. But this trip, as the family would soon discover, would be their last. The family had set up camp near a bubbling stream, the perfect backdrop for Jamie's afternoon sketches. His father, Brian Whitaker, was setting up the campfire, while his younger sister Emily played with their dog, a rambunctious golden retriever named Max. Jamie, however, was lost in his thoughts, his eyes tracing the intricate patterns of the leaves as they fluttered down from the trees. Around midday, Jamie told his parents he was going to fetch water from the stream. It was a short walk from camp, a path he had taken countless times before. He slung the water jug over his shoulder and disappeared into the woods, the sound of his footsteps gradually fading into the distance. As the hours passed, Brian and his wife, Linda, began to grow concerned. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Jamie had never taken this long to return. Brian tried calling out to him, but the woods swallowed his voice. "Jamie?" Brian called, his voice steady but tinged with worry. No answer. Minutes turned into an hour. Linda, normally calm and collected, began pacing nervously near the campfire. Emily clutched Max tightly, her face pale with fear. Brian, always the pragmatic one, told his wife to stay put and set off toward the stream, hoping to find Jamie. The forest, dense with trees and underbrush, seemed to close in around him as he moved deeper into the woods. But as Brian reached the stream, there was no sign of Jamie. The water was as clear as always, the rocks beneath the surface untouched. The path where Jamie had gone was as empty as the rest of the forest. No footprints, no sign of struggle, not even the faintest indication that Jamie had ever been there. It was as if the boy had simply vanished into thin air. Panic set in quickly. Brian raced back to camp, his heart pounding in his chest. He grabbed his wife by the shoulders and told her what he'd found. Linda's face went white with horror. They tried calling Jamie's name once more, but the forest remained silent, an impenetrable wall of trees and shadows. Within an hour, other campers in the park were alerted, and a search party was formed. Rangers, park officials, and volunteers scoured the area, their voices calling out through the trees. The search went on for days, then weeks. Search dogs were brought in, and helicopters flew overhead, their blades slicing through the quiet. But Jamie was nowhere to be found. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of the boy. The search party had combed every inch of the forest, but Jamie was gone, as though he had been swallowed by the earth itself. His disappearance became one of the most puzzling and haunting cases in Briarwood's history. A year passed, and then another. The park ranger assigned to the case, Eli Morgan, had been a rookie at the time. Jamie's disappearance was his first major case, and it had haunted him ever since. Eli had spent countless hours retracing Jamie's last known steps, going over the same ground, the same stream, but it was as if the forest itself refused to yield its secrets. Every year, on the anniversary of Jamie's disappearance, Eli returned to Briarwood National Park. He would stand in the same spot where Jamie had last been seen, staring into the dense forest, asking himself the same question that had plagued him for years. What did I miss? The answers, if there were any, remained hidden beneath layers of moss and leaves, locked away by a forest that held its secrets close. And yet, despite the lack of progress, there was one thing Eli was sure of. Jamie Whitaker was not just lost. Something had happened to him, something the forest had taken great care to conceal. Uh, Eli Morgan was fresh out of the academy when he took on his first major assignment as a park ranger in Briarwood National Park. He had been eager, full of idealism, and perhaps a bit naive. As he drove through the winding roads that led to the park, he had imagined a life in nature, caring for its beauty and guiding visitors through its trails. He had not expected to be thrust into one of the most haunting mysteries in Briarwood's history, Jamie Whitaker's disappearance. At the time, Eli was a rookie. His supervisor, Ranger Sarah Jacobs, had been more seasoned and knew how to handle the daily operations of the park. But this particular case, the search for Jamie, had quickly become Eli's responsibility. He was told it was a simple missing persons case, something that should have been solved within a few days. But as the search dragged on, it became anything but simple. Jamie Whitaker was just another name on a long list of people who had gone missing over the years in Briarwood. The national park, vast and untamed, had a reputation for swallowing people whole. Hikers, campers, even seasoned rangers had disappeared without a trace. But something about Jamie's case felt different to Eli. He couldn't shake the feeling that this case was more than just a routine search. Eli spent hours walking the forest trails, retracing Jamie's steps, hoping for any sign, any clue that might lead to the boy. But the forest remained silent, as if it was holding its breath, refusing to reveal its secrets. The trees stood tall and stoic, their roots deep within the earth, and the underbrush was thick and impenetrable. The streams, where Jamie had last been seen, flowed endlessly, but they never offered any answers. Each day, Eli became more convinced that something was terribly wrong. He would return to the ranger station each night, exhausted, his boots caked in dirt, his face drawn with worry. He tried to sleep, but sleep never came easily. His mind kept replaying the search, his footsteps in the forest, the calls for Jamie, the worried faces of the Whitaker family. He couldn't stop thinking about it. The guilt gnawed at him. Why couldn't he find Jamie? What had he missed? Over time, Eli found himself going back to Briarwood every year, always on the same date, the anniversary of Jamie's disappearance. It had become a ritual for him, an unspoken promise to himself and to the Whitaker family. He couldn't let go. The case haunted him, and he needed to know what had happened to that boy. Every year, he walked the same paths, visited the same stream, stood at the same spot, and asked himself the same question. What did I miss? But it wasn't just guilt that kept Eli coming back. He had developed a strange bond with Jamie, even though he had never met the boy. It was almost as if Jamie's spirit had become entwined with Eli's own. The forest, vast and unyielding, seemed to reflect Eli's internal struggle. He couldn't let go of Jamie, and the forest wouldn't let him forget. Each visit was a confrontation, not only with the past, but also with himself. He wasn't sure if he was searching for Jamie or searching for redemption. The years passed, and Eli's obsession with the case grew. His colleagues began to notice the change in him. His once bright-eyed enthusiasm had dulled. He had stopped smiling as much, his eyes clouded with the weight of his unfulfilled mission. Ranger Jacobs, the veteran of the station, had taken note of his increasingly solitary nature. She tried to talk to him about it, offering advice and support. But Eli always brushed her off. The truth was, he didn't know how to move on. Every year, he felt as though he were getting closer to an answer, yet the truth remained elusive, just out of reach. Then, one day, as the anniversary of Jamie's disappearance approached again, Eli found himself standing at the edge of the same stream, the water flowing quietly beneath the canopy of trees. The air was still, but the atmosphere felt thick with anticipation, as if the forest itself was waiting for something. It had been 10 years since Jamie had vanished, and yet the memory of that day, of that search, was as vivid as ever in Eli's mind. He stood there, staring at the water, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. His breath was steady, but inside, his heart was racing. This time, he felt something different. He couldn't explain it. But there was a feeling in the air, a sense that something was about to happen. Maybe this year, he thought, just maybe, he would find what he had been looking for. And as Eli stared into the murky water, he heard a sound, a faint rustling in the brush behind him. His head snapped to the side, his heart leaping in his chest. It wasn't an animal, it was something else. He squinted into the trees, trying to make out the shape in the shadows. The figure was small, almost indistinguishable from the forest itself, but Eli knew immediately what it was. It was a dog. A large German shepherd with ash-gray fur and piercing golden eyes stepped into the clearing. The dog moved with a purposeful grace, its steps deliberate as it walked toward Eli. It was as if the dog knew exactly where it was going, and to Eli's surprise, the dog stopped just a few feet away from him, its gaze never wavering. For a moment, Eli stood frozen, unsure of what to do. But then, as if on instinct, he crouched down slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, it sat down on its haunches, eyes locked onto Eli with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. There was something about this dog, something strange, something that felt significant. And at that moment, Eli realized something he had never considered before. Jamie's disappearance might not be a random event. Something far deeper, far darker, might be hidden in the shadows of Briarwood National Park. Koda had always been different. From the moment he was brought into the park's K9 unit, it was clear to Officer Riley Tran that this German shepherd was not like any dog she had worked with before. While other K9s were eager to please and quick to follow commands, Koda was unpredictable, his behavior erratic at times, almost as if he was marching to the beat of a different drum. Riley had seen Koda's file when she was assigned to him, and she had seen the warning labels. Dishonorably discharged from military service, unpredictable behavior, aggressive tendencies. It was a list that made most officers wary, and many had recommended he be put down or sent to another unit. But Riley, being someone who believed in second chances, saw potential in him. She saw the intelligence in his eyes, the focused determination that seemed to pulse under the surface of his wildness. She had worked with many dogs during her career, but there was something about Koda, the way he held his head high, as though he were always aware of something others couldn't see, the way his ears perked up at the faintest sound, and the way he could navigate the dense woods with an almost eerie precision. To Riley, Koda was a puzzle, one that she was determined to solve. When Koda was first introduced to the search and rescue operations in Briarwood, Riley's colleagues were skeptical. They didn't trust him. They didn't believe he had the temperament to handle the stressful nature of the job. But Riley was firm in her belief that Koda could be more than just a dog with a troubled past. And over time, she proved them wrong. The bond between Riley and Koda grew over months of training and real-world experience. Koda's unpredictable nature slowly gave way to something more reliable, a sharp instinct that allowed him to pick up on subtle clues, sniffing out missing persons with a precision that was almost supernatural. He was a true asset to Riley, but there were times when his behavior still unsettled her. There were moments when Koda would stare into the woods, his eyes unblinking, his body tense, as if he saw something she could not. One morning, during a routine training exercise in the forest, Riley noticed something strange about Koda. They were working on a standard search and recovery task, a simple drill designed to simulate the tracking of a missing person. Koda had done this 100 times before. He was usually quick to pick up the scent and follow it without hesitation. But this time, Koda had stopped. He had paused in the middle of the trail, his nose twitching in the air. And then, without warning, he started pacing. It was not the kind of behavior Riley had seen from him before. Koda's body moved in tight circles, the same pattern repeated over and over again, as if he were locked in some kind of trance. His eyes darted back and forth, staring intently at a moss-covered stump nearby. Riley frowned. This wasn't normal. She had seen Koda react to the scent of a person, but this was different. "Koda, what is it, boy?" Riley whispered, her voice low. She crouched down beside him, trying to get his attention, but Koda paid her no mind. He continued pacing, his growls growing louder, deeper, almost as if he was warning something off, or perhaps protecting it. Riley hesitated. She had been trained to trust her dog, but this felt off. She glanced around, trying to make sense of what Koda was doing, but the forest was as still as it had always been. She couldn't hear anything, see anything that would explain Koda's strange behavior. She looked at her fellow officers, but they stood motionless, waiting for her next move. Her instincts kicked in. Riley had learned to trust Koda's reactions, even when they didn't make sense. Maybe he was picking up on something she couldn't. She stood up slowly, giving Koda a comforting pat on the back and motioned for her team to follow her. The dog had made it clear that he wasn't going to let this go. "Koda, lead the way," Riley said softly. Without hesitation, Koda bolted into the woods, his powerful legs propelling him forward with incredible speed. Riley followed closely, her heart pounding in her chest. As they moved deeper into the forest, she could feel the air grow thick, almost suffocating. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. The further they went, the quieter it became, until there was only the sound of Koda's paws hitting the forest floor and the rustle of leaves underfoot. Riley's mind raced. She knew the area well. This was a part of Briarwood that was rarely traveled, a dense, overgrown section of the park that had always been avoided. The trees here grew tall and thick, their trunks gnarled and twisted. The ground was soft and damp, the earth giving way with each step. Koda led her to a small clearing, the sunlight filtering through the canopy above. The dog stopped abruptly in front of a large, moss-covered boulder. He sniffed the air and then began pawing at the ground, digging furiously as if he were trying to uncover something hidden beneath. Riley's breath caught in her throat. She stepped forward cautiously, kneeling down beside Koda. The dog's digging grew more frantic, his claws scraping against the earth. Riley hesitated for a moment, then reached down to help him. The soil was loose. And as she moved the dirt away, something solid came into view. It was bone, a small, delicate bone, likely human. Her heart sank. "Koda, good boy," Riley murmured, her voice shaking. She could feel the weight of the discovery settle over her like a heavy fog. She had found bones before, remains that had been left behind by animals, or perhaps washed up by the river. But this was different. This was a person. The realization hit Riley like a punch to the gut. She had found something no one had been able to for years. And as the dog continued to dig, Riley knew that this discovery was the beginning of something far bigger, something that would unravel the dark secrets of Briarwood and the tragic fate of Jamie Whitaker. The air was thick with tension as Riley knelt beside Koda, her hands trembling ever so slightly. The forest, usually calm and peaceful, now felt suffocating, its stillness pregnant with the weight of discovery. Koda, ever the determined tracker, continued digging with relentless energy, his paws scraping the dirt and leaves as if he had a singular purpose, to unearth something long buried. As Riley moved aside more of the dirt, her heart pounded in her chest. She had never expected a routine training session to turn into something like this. What had begun as a simple exercise to track a missing hiker had taken a sharp and unexpected turn. And yet, despite the dread creeping in, she knew one thing for sure. Koda had led her here for a reason. He wasn't just sniffing at the air. He had purpose, an instinct that Riley couldn't quite understand, but trusted completely. The more dirt she removed, the clearer it became. There, beneath the surface, lay not just bones, but something more. A faded bracelet. Riley's breath caught in her throat as she brushed the dirt away. The bracelet was delicate, silver, engraved with 3 letters. J.W. Her stomach churned. It couldn't be. Could it? The image of Jamie Whitaker, the missing 13-year-old boy, flashed through her mind. Riley had heard the story during her early training days. She had heard the whispers of the case that had gone cold for years, the boy who had vanished from Briarwood National Park without a trace. She had never expected to be part of the search, but here she was, standing in a part of the forest no one had dared to explore, uncovering a mystery that had haunted the park for a decade. "Koda, you did it," Riley whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked around at her fellow officers, who had remained a few paces behind. Their expressions were a mix of disbelief and concern, but no one spoke. There was no need for words. The discovery spoke for itself. Riley stood slowly, her body numb. She needed to call it in. This wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. This was something darker, something that went far beyond a simple search for a boy who had wandered too far from camp. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. This was only the beginning. Before she could reach for her radio, Koda abruptly stopped digging and sat back on his haunches, his golden eyes fixed on the ground. He didn't bark or whine. He simply watched, as if waiting for Riley to make the next move. It was an eerie moment, and Riley's skin prickled with the sensation that the dog knew something she didn't. She turned to her team. "Call it in. This is bigger than just one boy." As the officers spread out to secure the area and report the find, Riley couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, something the dog hadn't yet uncovered. But Koda seemed content to sit at the edge of the small clearing, his eyes never leaving the spot where the bracelet had been found. Minutes felt like hours as the rest of the team radioed in, and word spread quickly about the discovery. Riley felt a wave of unease wash over her. The forest, once familiar and comforting, now seemed like a labyrinth of secrets waiting to be exposed. It was as though every step they took further into Briarwood revealed another layer of mystery, one that had been buried for years. "Riley, are you okay?" one of the officers, a younger man named Jake, asked, his voice soft. He had worked with her before, but he could tell something was different about this case. "I don't know, Jake." "I don't know," Riley muttered, her gaze still fixed on Koda. The dog had not moved, and she couldn't help but feel that he was waiting for something more than just the bones of a long-lost boy. It wasn't long before the forensic team arrived, their equipment and expertise confirming what Riley had feared. These were human remains. The bracelet was identified as belonging to Jamie Whitaker, the missing boy whose name had once been just another story whispered among the rangers. Riley's heart sank, but at the same time, a part of her felt a twisted sense of relief. The case was no longer cold. It had been reignited. However, the implications were staggering. If Jamie had been here, if this was the place where he had met his end, what did it mean for the other disappearances in the park? Could they have all been connected? Riley's mind raced as she pieced together the fragments of the case. The mystery of Briarwood, a place known for its unexplainable disappearances, had just become much more personal. As the forensic team carefully collected evidence, Riley found herself at the edge of the clearing, standing next to Koda. The dog still hadn't moved, his gaze unwavering as if he were waiting for someone or something to approach. The forest felt alive now, the shadows between the trees deep and all-encompassing. Riley crouched down to Koda's level. "What is it, boy?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What else do you know?" Koda didn't answer, of course, but there was something in his posture that Riley couldn't ignore. He was ready, poised, as if the next part of the mystery was just around the corner. And in that moment, Riley understood. Koda wasn't just following scents. He was following something much deeper, something buried in the very soil of Briarwood itself. For the first time, Riley realized that her partnership with Koda wasn't just about tracking missing people. It was about uncovering the dark, twisted secrets of the forest, and maybe even the people who had been hiding them for years. As the forensic team finished their work and the evidence was packed up, Riley knew they weren't done. The mystery of Jamie Whitaker's death was only the first piece of a much larger puzzle, and Koda had already shown her the way. The forest was still, almost unnaturally so, as Riley and her team stood in the clearing, the weight of the discovery settling like a heavy fog around them. Koda had led them here, and now, as the forensic team worked tirelessly to gather the remains, Riley couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the cusp of something far darker than anyone had anticipated. She had seen many search and rescue operations in her career, but this one felt different. The forest, with its towering trees and dense underbrush, had always been a place of quiet beauty. But now it seemed like a labyrinth of hidden secrets, each corner holding something yet to be uncovered. Riley stood off to the side, her eyes still locked on Koda. The German shepherd sat motionless, his golden eyes never leaving the spot where Jamie's remains had been found. His body was tense, as if he were waiting for something Riley couldn't yet understand. She had seen Koda react to missing persons since before, but this was different. This was the first time she had seen him behave so intensely, so focused, as if he knew more than anyone else. "Riley, we've got it," one of the forensic officers, Frank, called over to her. "The remains are confirmed to be human. We've also found a few other items, pieces of clothing, a broken watch, and—" He trailed off for a moment before continuing. "And a bracelet. It's engraved with the initials JW. Riley's breath caught in her throat. JW. It couldn't be a coincidence. Her heart pounded as she glanced down at Koda, who remained perfectly still, as though waiting for her to act. She knew what had to be done next. Jamie Whitaker's disappearance, which had haunted Briarwood for years, was no longer a cold case. The boy they had been searching for, the boy who had vanished without a trace, was found. But as she looked around at the trees, the shadows stretching long across the forest floor, Riley knew this discovery was just the beginning. Koda had led her here, and it seemed that his instincts were guiding them toward something far more complicated than a missing child. There was something far darker lurking in the depths of Briarwood, something that connected Jamie's death to the unexplained disappearances that had plagued the park for years, and now. Koda seemed to know the way forward, his unwavering focus telling Riley that there was more to this than anyone could imagine. As the forensic team carefully bagged the evidence, Riley crouched beside Koda. She placed a hand on his broad head, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath her fingers. The dog didn't flinch or look away. Instead, he stared into the trees, his gaze sharp and intense, as if he were listening for something only he could hear. "What else, Koda?" Riley whispered, her voice barely audible. "What aren't we seeing?" Koda didn't respond, of course, but there was a depth in his eyes, a knowing that unsettled her. It was as though the dog understood something she didn't, something about the forest, the land, and the terrible truth hidden beneath it. Riley stood and took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. There was a sense of urgency now, an overwhelming need to uncover more, to find out who or what was behind Jamie's death, and there was something else, something in the back of her mind, a nagging feeling that the answers they were seeking wouldn't be easy to uncover. Briarwood had a way of keeping its secrets, and it seemed that no matter how many clues were uncovered, the forest always held something back. The team worked quickly to gather the evidence, but Riley couldn't help but feel that time was running out. She had a responsibility to the Whitaker family, to Jamie, to find out the truth. But every step they took into the woods seemed to lead them deeper into a labyrinth of lies, manipulation, and power that reached far beyond what they could see. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest, Riley turned to Frank. "We need to get this back to the station," she said, her voice firm. "We need to run a full analysis on everything. I don't care how long it takes. This case is just getting started." Frank nodded, his face grim. "I'll have the evidence sent to the lab immediately. We'll need to run DNA tests, confirm the identity, and see if there's anything else. Anything we missed." Riley nodded. "Keep me updated. I'll stay out here for a while longer. There's still something here. I can feel it." With that, the team packed up their equipment and began to leave the clearing, but Koda remained by Riley's side, watching the forest with a calm but unyielding gaze. Riley didn't move at first, her eyes scanning the shadows. The forest was silent again, but something felt off. The air had changed. Thicker, more oppressive, as if something was lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. As the last officer disappeared into the trees, Riley glanced down at Koda. He had not moved. His head was still turned toward the darkening woods, his ears slightly pricked. Riley followed his gaze, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't done here. Not yet. "Let's go, Koda," she said quietly, standing up and pulling herself away from the clearing. The dog stood beside her, his powerful body moving with quiet grace through the underbrush. As they walked, Riley couldn't help but think back to the moment when Koda had first led her to this spot. There had been a look in his eyes, a knowing as if he were trying to tell her something. They reached the edge of the clearing, where the trees began to close in around them. Riley took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever was next. Koda was more than just a dog. He was a partner, and something told her that whatever mystery Briarwood had been hiding for all these years, Koda was the key to unlocking it. The days following the discovery of Jamie Whitaker's remains were a whirlwind of activity. Forensics had confirmed Jamie's identity, and the evidence gathered from the clearing began to paint a grim picture, one that would haunt Riley for years to come. While the investigation continued, Riley's thoughts never strayed far from the boy they had found, and the bond she had forged with Koda grew stronger with each passing day. It was as if they'd become more than just partners in the field. They were connected, two souls navigating the labyrinth of Briarwood together. But just as the case seemed to be settling into a pattern, Koda's behavior changed again. It was early morning when the first sign appeared. Riley had just returned from a long night of review with the team, poring over evidence and analyzing Jamie's remains, when she noticed something odd. Koda had been restless all night, pacing back and forth in the small yard behind the ranger station, his ears perked and eyes scanning the darkness. Riley had dismissed it at first as simple anxiety. After all, the dog had witnessed a major discovery in the forest just days earlier. But now, something about his behavior felt different. There was urgency in his movements, a sense that he had sensed something just beyond reach. "Koda?" Riley called softly, stepping outside. The dog immediately stopped pacing and turned toward her, his golden eyes fixed on her with a focused intensity. It was then that Riley noticed it. The same deep, unwavering gaze Koda had worn during the search for Jamie, but this time there was something more, a flicker of recognition in the dog's expression. Riley crouched down to meet his level. "What is it, boy?" she asked, her voice low, barely above a whisper. Koda didn't respond. Instead, he let out a low growl, his body tense. Riley stood up slowly, her mind racing. What was it? What was Koda trying to tell her this time? Without another word, Koda bolted, dashing toward the trees surrounding the station. Riley followed without hesitation, her heart pounding in her chest. She had learned to trust the dog's instincts, and in that moment, she had no doubt that something was happening, something Koda had sensed before she did. They pushed through the underbrush, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the damp earth beneath them. Koda was relentless, his paws barely touching the ground as he moved deeper into the forest. Riley could barely keep up, but she pushed forward, determined to uncover whatever it was that had spooked the dog. And then, after what felt like an eternity, Koda stopped. Riley nearly collided with him as she caught up, her breath ragged. She looked around, but at first saw nothing. The trees were thick with moss, and the forest floor was blanketed with fallen leaves, obscuring the path ahead. But Koda was staring intently at a large, fallen log, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. "What is it, Koda?" Riley murmured, her heart beginning to race once more. She moved closer to the log, and that's when she saw it, a small clearing behind it, barely visible through the dense foliage. Koda was already on the move, his paws digging into the earth as he began to uncover something beneath the fallen tree. Riley's stomach churned. She had seen Koda react to buried objects before, but this felt different. It was as if the dog was more certain than ever, more focused than she had ever seen him. Riley knelt down next to Koda, brushing aside the dirt and debris that had accumulated over the years. Her hands were trembling, but she pushed through the fear. She had to know what was hidden beneath this fallen log. As her fingers parted the earth, something solid and smooth met her touch, a piece of bone. Her heart skipped a beat. Another one? She whispered under her breath, barely able to comprehend the weight of what she had found. A Koda barked once, a sharp, commanding sound that echoed through the trees. Riley took a deep breath and continued digging, her heart racing. As the soil was moved aside, more and more of the remains became visible. This time, it wasn't just bones. There were pieces of clothing, a pair of shoes, and a watch, exactly like the one Jamie had worn when he had disappeared. "Hold on, Koda," Riley muttered, her voice tight with emotion. "This can't be happening." And then she saw it, the unmistakable sight of a name tag. Riley's breath hitched as she picked up the small, battered ID card that had been buried beneath the log. Her heart dropped when she saw the name. Seth Tran. It took a moment for the name to register, but when it did, it felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under her. Seth Tran, Riley's 17-year-old cousin, the teenager who had disappeared 5 months earlier without a trace. The case that had gone cold and the search that had ended in heartbreak for her family. Seth had vanished, and now here he was, buried in the same forest where Jamie Whitaker had met his end. "No, no," Riley whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. She looked down at Koda, who was standing by her side, his gaze unwavering. He had led her here again, just as he had with Jamie. But this time, stakes were personal. The world seemed to spin as Riley processed the enormity of what she had just uncovered. The first body had been Jamie Whitaker, a boy who had been missing for years. But now, Seth, her cousin, someone she had known, someone she had loved, was buried here, too. And the connection between the two victims, however distant, seemed to scream out at her from the depths of the forest. Riley's mind raced. How was this possible? What was going on in Briarwood? The park that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a tomb, its shadows hiding secrets too terrible to imagine. She stood up slowly, looking around the clearing. Koda remained by her side, his eyes scanning the area as if waiting for the next clue to present itself. And Riley knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of the story. There was more to uncover, more to unravel, and she was determined to follow the trail wherever it led. But as she stood there, staring at the remains of her cousin, Riley couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker than a mere coincidence had led them to this place. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the truth was still hidden in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. The discovery of Seth Tran's remains, just months after Jamie Whitaker's body had been found, left Riley reeling. It was clear now, these weren't isolated cases. Briarwood National Park, a place once known for its natural beauty and tranquil solitude, was a graveyard, hiding the secrets of more than one missing person. And the truth, as Riley was beginning to understand, was much darker than anyone had imagined. Her heart ached for her family, especially for her aunt and uncle, Seth's parents, who had never stopped searching for their son. Riley had been part of the search efforts, hoping against hope that Seth was still out there, somewhere in the woods. But now, standing at the edge of the forest with Koda by her side, Riley knew that their worst fears had been realized. Seth had been murdered, just like Jamie, and whoever had done this had left a trail of death, a trail that led straight to the heart of Briarwood itself. The forensic team arrived at the clearing just as they had with Jamie's remains. They worked quickly, methodically, their faces grim as they collected the evidence and took the remains for further analysis. Riley could barely look at the scene. She had seen death before. She had been part of too many rescue missions to count. But this was personal. Seth wasn't just another victim, he was her family. And the thought that someone could do this to him, to Jamie, to anyone in Briarwood, made her blood run cold. Riley took a few steps back, her mind racing. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. What was the connection between Seth's death and Jamie's? Why had these two boys, seemingly unconnected, ended up in the same godforsaken place? The more Riley thought about it, the more she realized that these two cases were linked in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. But she knew one thing for sure: whoever was behind this had to be stopped. Riley glanced down at Koda, who was still standing at her side, his eyes scanning the woods as if he were trying to make sense of what had just happened. The dog's instincts were spot on, as they had been with Jamie, and now it seemed as though Koda was sensing something even Riley hadn't picked up on yet. He was waiting for something. "We need to get back to the station," Riley muttered under her breath. Her thoughts were a jumble, but one thing was clear. They were going to find the people responsible for this, and they were going to make sure they paid for what they had done. Back at the ranger station, Riley sat down at her desk, the weight of the cases pressing down on her. She had reviewed the evidence countless times, and yet something wasn't adding up. Seth's body had been buried in the same part of the forest as Jamie's. That wasn't a coincidence. The two victims had to have been targeted. But by who? It wasn't long before the answer came in the form of an unexpected lead, a tip-off from a local journalist named Dana Morales. Dana had been investigating a series of missing persons in the area for years and had gathered evidence that connected several disappearances to a group of wealthy teenagers from the Briarwood area. The connection wasn't clear at first, but the more Riley looked into it, the more she realized that Dana was on to something. These weren't random disappearances. They were orchestrated, and the people behind them had used their power and influence to keep the truth buried. Riley picked up the phone and dialed Dana's number. It rang twice before Dana's voice answered on the other end. "Riley?" Dana said, her voice sounding weary but determined. "I've been waiting for you to call." "I think you're onto something," Riley replied, her tone tight with urgency. "Tell me what you know." "Everything." Dana paused for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. "There's a group of boys, well-known families in the area. I've been tracking them for months now, and the more I dig, the more I uncover. They have a pattern. They lure people into the woods, young men, vulnerable ones, and then they kill them. It's not just random violence. This is deliberate. They've been getting away with it for years." Riley's stomach turned as she listened to Dana's words. She had suspected as much, but hearing it from someone else confirmed her worst fears. These weren't just two isolated murders. This was part of a much larger, much more sinister plan. And it was working. The killers had been able to keep their actions hidden for years, manipulating the authorities, using their family's influence to suppress investigations. Briarwood had become their playground, and no one had even realized it. "They've used their power to keep the investigations quiet," Dana continued. But with Jamie and Seth, it's different. The media's starting to catch on. People are asking questions. They can't hide this forever." Riley clenched her fists. "We can't let them get away with it. We need to expose them. And do you have proof?" "I have everything," Dana said. "I've been collecting evidence, tracking their movements, speaking to witnesses. They're connected to every missing person case in Briarwood over the last decade. These boys have been using their family's influence to keep the truth buried. But we're going to bring it to light. Together." Riley didn't hesitate. "Let's do it." The next few days were a blur of activity. Riley, Dana, and a small team of trusted officers began piecing together the web of lies and manipulation that had kept the truth hidden for so long. They uncovered emails, photos, and documents that linked the boys, whose families held powerful political and financial positions, to every missing person in Briarwood. The evidence was damning. There was no doubt about it anymore. This wasn't just a series of random disappearances. This was a carefully orchestrated cycle of murder. As the media began to pick up on the story, the pressure mounted. Public outrage spread like wildfire, forcing the authorities to reopen cold cases that had remained unsolved for years. The families who had used their wealth and influence to protect their children were no longer able to hide behind their power. And for the first time in a long time, justice seemed possible. But Riley knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The killers would be exposed, yes, but there was still so much more to uncover. The truth about Briarwood was darker than anyone had imagined. And the fight for justice was far from over. The atmosphere at the ranger station had shifted dramatically in the days following the public exposure of the wealthy teenagers behind the murders. What had once been a place of routine tasks and serene forest walks was now charged with urgency. Riley, alongside Dana and the investigative team, had spent sleepless nights piecing together a web of lies, manipulation, and power that had kept Briarwood's darkest secrets hidden for far too long. The breakthrough had come in the form of a connection between the Tran family and the Westcott family, one of the most influential political families in the area. It was an alliance that no one had suspected, at least not on the surface. The Westcotts were known for their charity work, their lavish galas, and their carefully curated public image. They were a family who had built their wealth on the back of business and politics, their reach extending far beyond Briarwood. But underneath that polished exterior was something far more sinister. Their involvement in a series of mysterious disappearances went back years, perhaps even decades. Riley had seen the Westcotts before, at social events, fundraisers, and local gatherings. The family was a fixture in Briarwood's high society, their influence extending well beyond the park's borders. Their eldest son, Ethan Westcott, had always been a golden child, the kind of person everyone wanted to be around. He had been charming, articulate, and beloved by the community. But now, as Riley dug deeper into the Westcott family's ties to the disappearances, she began to understand that Ethan's persona had been carefully crafted. He was a puppet, and his family, the powerful, wealthy Westcotts, had been pulling the strings all along. The more Riley uncovered, the more she realized that Ethan wasn't acting alone. There were others in his inner circle, young men from affluent families who had used their status to escape scrutiny. They had lured victims into the woods, including Jamie and Seth, under the guise of friendship, only to kill them in cold blood. And what was even more chilling was the fact that the Westcott family, with all their power and influence, had been shielding them for years, using their connections to bury the truth. Riley sat in her office, poring over the files Dana had given her. The connections were undeniable. Ethan Westcott, along with his friends, had been involved in several of the murders in Briarwood. But it wasn't just about the teenagers. Their parents, powerful figures in local politics, had suppressed investigations and manipulated the narrative. The Westcotts had long been able to use their wealth to keep law enforcement and media outlets at bay, preventing the truth from coming to light. But not anymore. With the media now reporting the scandal, public outrage had exploded. The community that had once idolized the Westcotts now turned against them. People who had once brushed off rumors about the family's influence were now demanding answers. And the pressure was mounting. Riley could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her chest. This was more than just a case. This was about exposing a dark undercurrent in Briarwood, a network of corruption that reached into the highest echelons of power. Riley glanced at Koda, who was sitting quietly beside her desk, his golden eyes locked onto her. He had been with her through every step of this investigation, guiding her through the twists and turns with his sharp instincts. Riley had come to rely on him, not just as a partner, but as a friend. And she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Just then, the door to her office opened, and Frank, one of the senior officers on the case, walked in. His expression was grim, his face drawn with exhaustion. He'd been working nonstop for days, and Riley knew that the strain was starting to take its toll. Riley, Frank said, his voice low, there's something you need to see. We found more evidence. Riley followed Frank down the narrow hallway to the evidence room. Inside, a team of officers was gathered around a table, sorting through documents, photos, and items retrieved from the Westcott family's estate. Frank handed her a thick manila folder, and as Riley opened it, she felt her stomach drop. The folder contained photos of the Westcott family, but these were not the polished images that the public knew. These were candid shots, taken from hidden cameras and anonymous sources, showing Ethan and his friends engaging in activities that left little to the imagination. There were pictures of them in the woods, laughing and drinking, with the bodies of their victims barely hidden under piles of leaves. Other images showed the teens cleaning up after their gruesome acts, their faces masked in a twisted blend of satisfaction and indifference. "Where did this come from?" Riley asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We've been digging," Frank said, his tone tinged with disbelief. "Dana helped us track down a few witnesses, people who had been too scared to come forward before. One of them provided these images. They were taken by someone who was close to the group, someone who saw what they were doing but couldn't stop them." Riley looked down at the photos, her hands trembling. "This is it," she muttered. "This is the proof we need. We can't let them hide anymore." Frank nodded. "The thing is, Riley, the Westcotts aren't just going to roll over. They have enough money and power to shut this all down. We're going to need more than just these photos to bring them down. We need the hard evidence, the proof that links them directly to the murders." Riley took a deep breath. "We'll get it. We have to." As she left the evidence room, Riley couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the tip of the iceberg. The Westcott's power didn't stop at Briarwood's borders. They had influence far beyond the park, and Riley knew that taking them down would require more than just legal tactics. It would take everything they had, everything the community had, to stand up to the corrupt web that had been spun over the years. The truth about Briarwood was no longer hidden. But the fight for justice was only just beginning. The pressure was mounting, and Riley could feel the weight of the task ahead bearing down on her. The Westcott family was not just a powerful political force. They were a symbol of corruption in Briarwood, a town that had long prided itself on its close-knit community and natural beauty. But beneath that veneer of tranquility lay a darkness, a web of deceit and manipulation that had been festering for decades. And now, with the photos, the evidence, and the growing public outcry, Riley knew the truth couldn't be hidden any longer. The media had exploded with the story. What had once been whispers in the shadows was now front-page news, plastered across every outlet in the region. The faces of Ethan Westcott and his friends had been revealed. Their twisted deeds exposed for all to see. No longer could they hide behind their wealth and influence. The public demanded answers, and Riley was determined to ensure they got them. Dana Morales had been instrumental in this breakthrough. As an investigative journalist, she had spent years tracking the mysterious disappearances in Briarwood, and her work had now come to fruition. But Dana wasn't content to rest on her laurels. She was as determined as ever to see the case through to its end. "The truth is out, Riley," Dana said, her voice crackling through the phone as Riley stood outside the ranger station. "Now, it's time to make sure the system can't sweep this under the rug. The Westcotts are powerful, but they've underestimated the public's hunger for justice. This is our moment." Riley nodded. Even though Dana couldn't see her, she could hear the fire in Dana's voice, the same fire that had kept her going through the darkest moments of this investigation. Together, they had uncovered the deep-rooted corruption in Briarwood. But Riley knew it wasn't just about exposing the killers. It was about taking down an entire system that had allowed them to operate with impunity for so long. "We can't stop now," Riley said, determination in her voice. "We need to make sure the law does its job. The Westcotts can't be allowed to buy their way out of this." As the investigation continued to unfold, the weight of the truth was starting to take a toll on everyone involved. The Westcotts, despite their public humiliation, were still powerful enough to push back. Riley knew they would use every trick in the book to undermine the case: bribery, threats, and legal loopholes. But this time, they were dealing with more than just a few brave individuals. They were facing an entire community that had been awakened, and they couldn't control that. The breakthrough came when Dana uncovered a crucial piece of evidence: a set of emails that connected the Westcotts to a larger, or say, more organized network. These emails, intercepted from various sources within the political and business world, revealed that the Westcotts had been using their wealth not only to protect their sons, but to ensure that anyone who threatened their power was silenced. Their grip on Briarwood was far more extensive than anyone had realized. They had influence over local law enforcement, the media, and even politicians on the state level. Riley and Dana worked tirelessly to verify the emails and cross-reference them with the testimonies from the witnesses who had come forward. They began to build a case that was airtight, piece by piece. But as the walls closed in on the Westcotts, their counterattack was swift. They tried to discredit the evidence, painting Dana as a sensationalist and Riley as an unstable officer with a personal vendetta. Riley knew it was coming, but she refused to back down. Her personal stake in the case, her connection to the victims, especially Seth, only fueled her resolve. She had seen the brutality of the Westcotts firsthand, and she wouldn't let their wealth and power erase the memories of the lives they had destroyed. With Dana's help, the story broke wide open. The media, once hesitant to challenge the Westcotts, now had no choice but to report the truth. Public outrage reached a boiling point. The people of Briarwood, once complacent in the face of their town's dark secrets, were no longer silent. Social media exploded with calls for justice, and protests began to fill the streets. The Westcotts could no longer hide behind their name or their wealth. The truth was out, and it was unstoppable. Riley stood in front of the press, her heart pounding in her chest as the cameras flashed around her. She had prepared for this moment, but it still felt surreal. The faces of Jamie and Seth, the innocent lives lost, filled her mind as she addressed the crowd. The weight of their deaths, the injustice they had suffered, was something she could never forget. And today, she was giving them the voice they had never had. It's time for Briarwood to face the truth," Riley said, her voice steady and strong. "For too long, the Westcott family has used their power to hide the terrible things they've done. But today, that ends. Today, we will hold them accountable for the lives they've stolen. No one is above the law." The crowd erupted in applause, their support ringing out loud and clear. Riley felt a surge of emotion, but she quickly steeled herself. This was just the beginning. The Westcotts hadn't been brought to justice yet, but this was the first step. The investigation was ongoing, and Riley knew they still had work to do. But for the first time in a long while, she felt hope. Koda, who had been by her side throughout this entire ordeal, sat calmly beside her as she spoke. His golden eyes were fixed on the crowd, and for a moment Riley couldn't help but think that he understood, that he had known all along what needed to be done. They had uncovered the truth, and together they would see it through. Later that night, as Riley sat at her desk, reviewing the latest developments, a sense of peace washed over her. The truth had come to light, and no amount of wealth or influence could hide it any longer. The people of Briarwood had spoken, and now it was time for the justice system to do its job. But as Riley looked at Koda, who lay quietly at her feet, she knew that the fight wasn't over. There were still more victims to be uncovered, more lies to be exposed. And no matter how difficult the journey ahead might be, she and Koda would face it together, as they always had. It had been a few months since the explosive revelations about the Westcott family and their twisted web of influence in Briarwood. The town, which had once been shackled by fear and secrecy, was slowly beginning to heal. The media frenzy had died down, replaced by a new, quieter determination. A determination to rebuild, to take back the community that had been stolen from them. Riley had watched this transformation unfold, knowing that the fight was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope for Briarwood's future. The Westcotts had been arrested, and their empire was crumbling. With the evidence now fully in the hands of law enforcement, the case moved forward, though it was far from a simple victory. The legal battle would be long and arduous, but the tide had turned. The power that had once protected the Westcotts was now useless. Public opinion had shifted irrevocably, and the pressure to seek justice for the victims, Jamie, Seth, and the others, was overwhelming. For Riley, however, there was one thing that made the victory feel even more significant. It wasn't just the arrest of the perpetrators or the breaking of the case. It was Koda, the loyal German shepherd who had guided her through the darkest corners of the forest, who had led her to Jamie's remains and Seth's, who had stayed by her side through every step of the investigation, was finally being recognized for his incredible service. The department had called him a hero, and the award ceremony was scheduled for the following week. It was a small, intimate gathering, just a few officers, local officials, and the people who had worked alongside Koda to uncover the truth. But for Riley, it felt monumental. Koda wasn't just a dog. He was a symbol of persistence, of loyalty, of the strength that comes from following your instincts, even when the path ahead is unclear. The day of the ceremony, Riley stood with Koda at her side, her heart swelling with pride. Koda, always dignified, sat calmly beside her, his gaze focused but gentle. The crowd around them was small, but every person there understood the importance of the moment. The ceremony was brief, but Riley's words were heartfelt. Koda didn't just help us find the answers, Riley said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. He helped us find hope. He showed us the way when we were lost. He led us through the forest, not just to the remains of victims, but to the truth. And for that, I will be forever grateful. The audience clapped, and Riley's eyes met Koda's. His golden eyes seemed to understand, as if he knew that this was his moment. His recognition for the role he had played in bringing justice to Briarwood. It wasn't just about the award, though. It was about something far deeper, the bond between a human and a dog, forged through trials and challenges, built on trust and love. The ceremony ended with Koda receiving a medal for bravery and service. The award, while significant, felt secondary to Riley. It was the unspoken understanding between them, the quiet bond they shared, that mattered the most. Riley knew that Koda had been more than just her partner in this case. He had been her anchor, her guiding light when everything else felt uncertain. Later that evening, as Riley walked with Koda through the now peaceful park that had once been a site of so much grief, she reflected on everything they had accomplished. The park had been silent for so long, its woods echoing with the sorrow of lost lives. But now, as the sun set over the trees, there was a sense of peace, a feeling that, while the scars would never fully disappear, the healing had begun. "Thank you, Koda," Riley whispered, her voice barely audible. The dog looked up at her, his tail wagging slightly, his eyes soft but knowing. He didn't need words to understand what she meant. He'd been there through it all, never wavering, always ready to do what was necessary. As Riley stood there in the fading light, she realized that the lessons of this case weren't just about uncovering the truth or exposing the lies of the Westcotts. They were deeper, more personal. She had learned the importance of persistence, of listening to your instincts, even when others told you to let go. She had learned that sometimes the truth is hidden, waiting to be found in the quietest moments, in the smallest details. And most of all, she had learned that justice is not always a matter of following the law. Sometimes it's about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and the town of Briarwood was beginning to heal. The Westcotts were facing charges, and the lives of the victims, Jamie and Seth, would not be forgotten. But as Riley walked through the park with Koda at her side, she knew that their work was far from done. There would always be more cases, more mysteries to solve, and more challenges to face. But with Koda by her side, Riley was ready for whatever came next. Koda had shown her that justice doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it walks on four paws. And in that moment, standing with him in the woods that had once been a place of fear, Riley realized just how true that was.